starting here probably just a few minutes later than normal, which is sometimes the case. We'll probably start the official study at about 3 minutes past the hour. But this allows a chance to ensure that each of the destinations are working, that everyone's squared away, and everyone who normally joins us for our 2 Corinthians chapter 8 continuing study will be able to participate. Terry is not with us today. I'll go ahead and get that off of the table. Terry's taking care of some important family members as they adjust to the additional care needs for his father-in-law. And so instead, as is common historically, from Tennessee, we've all gone to Texas now, and we brought Texas to the Bible study. And so it's good to see both Reagan and Chris with us. Reagan, how are you doing? We'll start with you.
I'm doing great. I'm glad to have a Tennessee connection back. We missed out on Camp Tennessee this year, so I hope maybe I can see some of my Tennessee people. That's exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I missed my regular drive to camp and see everyone both drop off and pick up where we get to experience that. We've got people who will be in the Bible study who are also in Texas, but some from West Virginia, some from Florida, obviously Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama. A good chunk of the Southeast gets represented. Chris, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Philip. I'm glad to be a part of it today, man. I don't know how bunches of Tennessee connections except Sam Houston. They tell me Sam Houston's from Tennessee.
It kind of connects. I've got two possible questions, and you guys can pick your answers. All right, you can answer them both too. So these are important things, serious things. But first question is your favorite place to get a taco in Texas? Second question is your favorite memory with the Alamo?
Reagan, you go first, man. Reagan's got the Alamo cornered. His sister works there, so
yeah. My sister is the educational specialist at the Alamo, and so go to the Alamo when it opens again after Corona, I guess. But we would make our trek to San Antonio about yearly when my dad was a school administrator. And so you had to go to the Alamo when you went, like that was part of the whole deal. And now my sister works there, which is kind of crazy, like the birth of Texas freedom or something. Favorite taco place, man, like there are so many to choose from. Chuck Boyd, who's a Tennessee guy, he came and he was asking about that. And I said, well, what have you tried? And he said, well, the only place I've ever had is Tommy Tamales in the Metroplex. And I said, well, that's like the #1 ranked taco place in Texas. So you just went to the top of the list right away. So if you're ever in the DFW area, try out Tommy Tamales. That's some good stuff.
We'll add it to the adventure list.
Yeah.
Chris, what you got?
The Alamo, like I've seen it a handful of times. I honeymooned there, Summer and I, so we didn't pay
at
a
the
lot
Alamo?
of attention. But we did at the the river walk and the whole deal, and so we got our Alamo look in. We had the same reaction. If you've not been there, you would say that is really small. Like that's the #1 thing you would say, and it really makes you wonder how they were able to do what they did. And it's a pretty cool story. My favorite tacos. So in Texas, we pride ourselves on two things: our Tex-Mex and our barbecue. And there's a place about 15 miles from here called Cow Burners. They're a barbecue place, but on Tuesdays, they have Taco Tuesdays. And Summer and I went to Taco Tuesdays 2 days ago. They take all their barbecue meat, they put it in whatever taco you want, flour or corn. They add all the, stuff and pico and cilantro. And if I had another thumb or two more thumbs, I'd just stick them all up.
All right, cool. Add that one to the list too. We were supposed to go to San Antonio for our family as well this summer and go see the Alamo. It was actually on the table. We were going to be there just a few weeks ago was the plan, and go visit our son who is working as an intern north of Austin, and then go down to San Antonio and go to the Alamo like everyone from Tennessee is supposed to do. Obviously that didn't happen like we planned. In Texas, by the way, I would probably say as a combination answer to both of you, Torchy's is at the top of my list as a taco joint, particularly their trailer park taco with the hillbilly option on the side. Make it trashy with queso. That'd probably be like my taco selection. But if I was going to put barbecue near both of you, it would be Shep's right there in Palestine, Texas.
That's not far from us.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Stanley's in Tyler. If we're talking barbecue, if you've had that. You need to try that.
If we're going barbecue,
problem
I'll
at
go to Austin
Torchy's-
and go to Franklin's. So
Oh yeah.
There's some good stuff. Cooper Barbecue in
Yeah.
New Braunfels area is great. If you go to
Is this the
Torchy's, don't
barbecue
get the
hour?
cups, because if you get the cups, your kids ask you what that word is on the cup, and now you're in a pickle. So
we just get the tacos and go. Just the tacos and go.
It
All
is
right,
good.
so let's get to the matter at hand before we get me really, really hungry and distracted from what we're doing any more so than already, and dig into 2 Corinthians, particularly chapter 8. The text here is super interesting. We've already walked through, and Chris was part of our introduction to the text a couple times. He's been with us in 2 Corinthians. He's been with us, I think, in 1 Corinthians as well. And now we're in the middle part of a series of Paul's considerations. Paul is a masterful writer, inspired, obviously, but you can see the uniqueness that is Paul in his letters. He makes great transitions. He's done that with both chapter 6 and chapter 7. And I want to emphasize that transition process. In both of those two chapters, he made a reach for the Corinthians and then an invitation back. And his reach for them was to request that they open their hearts. And his request back is, see, my heart's wide open too. That is the introduction to both chapter 6 and chapter 7, which then leads us to the 8th chapter. And in chapter 8, Paul is expressing a series of maybe 3 sections, although sometimes he break it up into 2, of how to take that changed heart and that reciprocal relationship and expand its potential to a much larger group of brethren. Stop looking so much inwardly and start seeing the kingdom of God in a larger sense. And maybe you guys want to have some introductory comments. This is a conversation at a table. It's a reminder that we're at the coffee shop right now, just chatting about the text, and everyone else is eavesdropping. But we're probably going to read verses 1 through 7 in a second. But what you guys got? We'll go around the horn. We'll discuss it. Reagan's a first-time visitor here, and so we'll let you go first if you've got something you need to bring to the table before we get into the meal.
Well, I like the way you frame that idea of trying to reconcile with the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians was so brutal. I mean, he was just hitting them over the head with a 2x4, and they changed, and how beautiful that was. And he says, now my heart's open to you. Like, I don't have anything against you. If you don't have anything against me, we can reconcile. And I think you're absolutely right. He's broadening that out to the kingdom, but there's something really powerful in that this is a primarily Gentile church. I think we'd probably all agree with that. And he is asking them to open their heart to their Jewish brethren specifically. Your Jewish brethren really need your help from a financial standpoint. And so, I mean, how much is that going to help with that reconciliation? And obviously there were some bumps in the road between Jewish and Gentile Christians. If you're willing to open up your heart and your pocketbook to help these Jewish Christians. So I love the way you frame that. 8 and 9 maybe is one whole section on that idea.
Chris?
Yeah, the transition I think is important. Chapters 8 and 9 is going to be about this contribution, and we're going to talk about that and its importance. And that's a bigger issue that has to do with brethren who are different than you in terms of Jewish, Gentile, and farther away. I think that the transition from 7 to 8 is key. He'd been talking about how you have to look at yourselves. You guys have not been doing the right stuff. You need to repent. You need to change the way you've done things. And you did. You were sorrowful, chapter 7. I know you guys covered this. You kind of got your ducks back in a row. Now, once you've worked on you and you've gotten your church, your local work kind of back, let's broaden our scope and see that it's bigger than you. I think growth in the faith is sort of 3 stages. It's sort of, look, Philip's got to work on Philip. If he's got problems, he needs to work on those problems. But don't spend your whole life focused just on your problems, Philip. Now you've got a local church with some issues. So, Philip, you need to focus on your local church and what you guys can work on. And then once you've got that, it's not like, ooh, we're done. There's a whole world of believers out there. There are Christians that are all over. And I love the way that he's saying, okay, you've got that worked out. Now let's see if you can dig deep, this time financially, and let's help people you're never even going to meet to fix their problems as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is important, verse 1, and we'll read it in just one more second, is he's changing where they're looking. Paul at times will say, follow me as I follow after Christ. Sometimes he'll say, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? But verse 1, he says, now look at the grace of God as seen through the lens of the Macedonian believers. Chris, do you want to read some for us, if you could? Start us off with verses 1-7.
Yeah, absolutely. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1-7, reading from the New American Standard Updated. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this, verse 5, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. So we urged Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well. Verse 7, but just as you abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge, and in all eagerness, and in the love we inspired in you, see that you abound in this gracious work also.
Yeah, I love this, the whole tenor of this text, because it's as if, and this kind of plays on the context of the culture in the Greco-Roman world of the day. Paul is laying a gauntlet down in front of them and is challenging them to have something that we're not comfortable with, healthy competition in good. Like, this isn't healthy competition against each other. This is healthy competition together towards a common goal. And he's like, here's a gauntlet. Look what's going on over in Macedonia. What kind of heart do you have? What kind of ideas are you willing to put on the table to be spiritually successful? At least that's one of like the first things that I see as he's trying to convict them to do more than just make their house right and get everything in order on the inside. By the way, Reagan, there's a standard rule. Interrupt me anytime you want. Interrupt Chris anytime you want, because Chris is experienced, regular here. And so both of us probably have too much to say.
Well, no, man, it's good. You know, you think about all the metaphors that Paul uses, athletic metaphors, competition metaphors. You know, you run in such a way as to win, but it's not by pushing the other guy down. You know, you're spurred on and you're encouraged by what he's doing. But you've got to push beyond what you believe to be your best to go even beyond that. And certainly that's what the Macedonians did, you know, even in their poverty. They're giving beyond even really what they probably ought to, because that's the love they had. And the Corinthians, on the other hand, you know, they've got an abundance, and so they have an even greater requirement to give. But you know, Chris knows this about me. I see grace in so many different things, and really these two chapters 8 and 9, are chapters about grace. If you want to talk about giving, you can't really talk about giving in a spiritual sense without grace. There in verse 1, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. And then verse 2, that in great trial of affliction and abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. And so he connects this idea of the grace that you have, or the grace that you've been given, and that should abound in the riches of your liberality, that it's manifested in so many different ways, but specifically in your willingness to give and to give favor. At the end of chapter 9, he uses those same two terms again, the grace that we have from God, and then the abundance of our liberality. The entire section highlights how the grace of God, it motivates us, it enriches us. And if we're motivated and enriched, then we're going to give liberally and abundantly and share our gifts. That word charis, grace, is found 10 times in these two chapters. Verse 1, verse 4, which New American Standard says favor, this gift also. Verse 6, verse 7, which Chris's translation said this gracious work in you. Verse 9, verse 16, verse 19, and then 3 times in chapter 9 as well. And so like if you're marking, I know Chris is a big marker in your Bible, like mark those 10 times that word grace is found, and you're going to see that there's a lot more to this word maybe than what we generally think of or limit it in terms of grace. Grace includes gift giving and our attitude and our generosity, and then ultimately our thankfulness back to God. And if we have all those things, I mean, given to a brother in need is nothing. I mean, we're going to want to do that because we see grace.
Yeah. I like that point right there. I think that there's a motivation from the inside out. I don't know if you're supposed to have a favorite New Testament church. Has that been discussed on this program? Like, can you have like the church that maybe it's not the one you want to go to because you don't want to cherry pick just the best one. But if you were, for me, it's easy. There's not even really a competition here. And it's probably not Corinth, although I'm super intrigued by them. Super intrigued. It's the Thessalonians. I mean, how great were the Thessalonians? You know, they get this bad rap from Acts 17 because it said that those in Berea were more noble-minded. That was talking about the Jewish knuckleheads. Like the church there was fantabulous. It was great. And you go to and that's Macedonia, by the way, for those who are listening. He's saying, look, the churches in Macedonia have been giving even beyond what they have the ability to give. That includes Philippi, also a great church, great letter, and Thessalonica. And so I'm over here in 1 Thessalonians, right? I'm right here in 1 Thessalonians 1. And listen to these 3 verses and tell me if these people were willing to dig in their pockets to give and help God's people. For the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith towards God has gone forth, so that we have no need to say anything. Verse 9. For they themselves report about us, Paul writes, what kind of a reception we had with you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, that is Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath to come. Paul said, what am I supposed to write to you guys? Like, you talk to everybody about Jesus. Everywhere I go, people know about how you changed your lives and you've turned to the Lord. And that church was begging for an opportunity to take all that grace and all this hope and just help people with it. And of course, the Corinthian church was lagging. They weren't there. They had a lot more problems. But I love that he's saying, look, guys, you've had your problems, but the Thessalonian journey, you need to excel still more, 1 Thessalonians, and you've got to get there. So I'm glad to know that Lindale's not the only church that gets compared to Thessalonica every couple of months. Corinth did as well.
Yeah, and here's the thing to think about. First century culture, the concept of grace, like Reagan was pointing out, isn't limited to a very minor textual definition of unmerited favor. What it is that it's an expanded view, that if you receive grace, it is expected of you to take what you have received and share with others. Like, it's mandated. And if you fail to do so, you fail to actually meet the model of grace that is expected by all in their culture. Further, it should be able to come back and be as a full cycle. There's a concept of 3 graces that is kind of true to that culture. Paul plays on it in my perception of his writing. David de Silva has written quite a bit about it. And if you want to read about grace and honor in the culture, that's a great text to think through that singular idea. But I think it matches this moment where Paul is looking to the brethren in Macedonia, the Thessalonians, saying, look what they've done with the grace that they've received. You can do this. And he's actually kind of hinting at, you can do more. I think that's probably part of the term there, is because by contrast, this multicultural group in Corinth had the potential to have a larger impact economically due to a number of factors. And so they could really do, as Chris would want the branding to say, they could still excel still more and probably to a higher degree than we could even perceive initially. Reagan, did you have something else? I didn't know.
Yeah, I sure do. Like that idea of not limiting what Grace is talking about, I think really just it clears up a lot of the theological hurdles that maybe sometimes we have, that others have, that people growing up in the church sometimes have, like I didn't hear enough about grace enough and those sorts of things. Like grace is used 4 different ways in the New Testament, and that's not just the New Testament. That's the way it's used in Greek literature as well, just like you're talking about. And that book is a great recommendation for seeing that honor system and what grace is. That's a religious word for us, but for them, it wasn't. It was like a part of everyday thing. If you showed grace to me, I showed grace in return. There's a reciprocal nature to that. But we see all 4 ways that grace is used right here in our text. So number one, grace is used like for attractiveness that invites a favorable reaction. So that's verse 7. You abound in this gracious work also. So it's gracious. It's that idea. There's also that attitude or disposition of grace or favor toward another, graciousness. We see there in verse 6. So we urge Titus that as he had begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well. There is what's given, the gift that is actually given by grace. And so that's verse 4, imploring us with much urgency, we would receive the gift and the fellowship for the ministering of the saints. It doesn't have to be a gift from God. Like I can give a gift of grace as well. And then maybe the one that we see the least, like, because it's not translated grace, is the idea that we return something, thanksgiving or honor or a gift in return to what's been given to us. So verse 16, that same word charis is used, but thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus. So you see all four of those right here in our text, that grace is much more reciprocal. And this whole idea of, well, you get a gift from grace from God, and that means that you can do nothing. That's just, it's not biblical. It's not even like what the word meant. Like, no, you get an awesome gift that you cannot repay. So you do everything in your power to pay that forward, right? Whether it's in thanks to God and worship to him, or in giving a gift to your brother who's in need and showing grace to him. And if we can get that concept, man, it clears up so many things, not just, theologically, but practically. How am I supposed to live my life? I'm supposed to live a gracious life where I've received grace and now I'm giving grace in return, whether thanks to God or in helping other people.
Philip, that takes on a very spiritual meaning initially, but it's tangible here. And I think Reagan's going to make that point. It really lives in a thing. I have to, Reagan's got the Charis cornered, so I'm leaving Charis to Ray. But there is a koinonia sighting here as well. And I think it's worth mentioning the koinonia sighting. And I'm sorry, guys, that's all the Greek you're getting today. They're in fact like right next to each other in verse 4. We always talk about fellowship, right? Koinonia, fellowship. And we're all in 1 John going, it's spiritual, it's mental, it's non-tangible. It's a relationship with dead people who've gone before and God in heaven. Look, verse 4, the grace of fellowship in the support of the saints. Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue that fellowship means a hall with casseroles. I'm sure Philip can preach on that another time. But it definitely meant digging into your pocket and pulling money out of that pocket, even more than's even in the pocket. Like you're searching through the couches here to get what you can to give it to actual Christians in need. Like this idea that grace and fellowship are just all sort of kumbaya, sing and pray. Yeah, it starts with that. This appreciation, but then, it's like, what can I actually do? Reagan and I were teaching Matthew 7 last night, like obey literally. Like, what can I actually do to show this? And, Paul's been preparing them for this. 1 Corinthians, even when they were kind of a mess, he still wrote in 1 Corinthians 16, even though you're kind of a mess, be sure on the first day of the week to take money out of your pocket and put it in a jar, because we've got work to do. Fellowship means actually doing things to help other Christians. And of course, he built that. And then we'll talk about it in a minute. But Romans, we can come around and find out that, those in Achaia actually did pretty well. And they did. That's Corinth. And they did dig in and start helping.
Yeah, we'll read verses 8 through 15 in just a second. And I'll probably drop that information for us in a moment. You guys kind of shift there. I use this working definition for fellowship. Two fellows on a ship. If you don't work together physically, you're not going to get anywhere together. And I think that's the most practical definition of a more complicated idea. And if the destination for us is to help someone, then we got to both be working. And that's just a really practical look at something that I think Chris is correct. We and I'll say this loosely, spiritualize fellowship. And we think about it in non-concrete terms. When Paul doesn't limit it to that use, he uses it to describe the particular relationship he had with churches in his evangelistic work. And he said, we have fellowship together. When I do X, you're doing X, because we are those two fellows on a ship together and we're working together. I think that's just kind of a good way, for at least for me, to kind of see the text that way. Before we start verse 8 and read through verse 15. Reagan, did you have anything else?
Well, I mean, if that's true, like if we really are like fellows in Christ and it's ministering to the saints, right? Like you have a relationship here that is based on what you're about to read in verse 9. Verse 9 is like one of my favorite verses in all the Bible. Like,
well, you could read it then.
oh, that's excellent. If it's based on that, then of course, why wouldn't I reach into my pocket? I mean, this is my brother in Christ, and we have fellowship in something far more deeper than anything else. So why wouldn't I reach into my pocket to help my brother in need or to help my brother in preaching the gospel, and then have that fellowship with them?
So go ahead, if you would, and read us through verse 15. So 8 through 15 right now.
Cool. This is from the New King James Version. I speak not by commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. And in this I give advice. It is to your advantage not only to be doing what you begun and were desiring to do a year ago, but now you must also complete the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to desire it, so there also may be a completion out of what you have. For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that you should be for that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance may also supply your lack, that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. My high school kids know that like that was super hard for me to read all of those verses without stopping and commenting, but it's powerful.
Yeah, I have a little subnote in this section as a reminder to me that diligence is superior to motivation. That's like a subnote for part of this, because that's what Paul is in essence trying to tell them. Like your diligence will always beat your momentary motivation. They committed high at the end or the beginning, but they weren't finishing because their diligence faded. Or to quote someone else, they stopped eating the frog. If you wanted to make some crossover references, we can. But what else do we see in this text besides that first look at what's going on?
Let me just say, he mentioned, I think, the word equality. I'm pretty sure the New American Standard and the New King James use that word both in verse 13 by way of equality, and that there may be equality. And that's just not a term people want to talk about today. I mean, we're all, we're in America. It's we got capitalism going. We've got all the, those who work harder get more. And this idea that you would strive for equality with brethren, and if you have more and they have less, you would give what you have and may even lower yourself to the level of them. And while that can be almost impossible for people to get financially, you have to start back, and Reagan was doing this with grace, but you have to start back with what we have in Christ is equal. We all have the grace of God. We all have the power of the blood of Jesus. And not only have what we gotten from God is equal, we all get it, but we've all given the same amount, and that is ourselves. I'm talking about verse 5, like we gave ourselves to God. We gave everything about us to God. We gave our hearts, mind, soul, body, family, goods, income, like all of it is subject to God. And I think that in America, this is particularly tough, guys, that we can kind of buy into that. He gave all Christians the same grace, and we've all given ourselves to the Lord. Yet when it comes to goods and needs, I don't know, we kind of get back into that. Well, I've worked harder than you, and I have more schooling than you. And I can give you some, but the idea of me just making it equal. And I'm not saying we just socialism, give everybody the same amount of money. I'm saying if someone has need and you're above that need and they're a child of God, there should be no limit to the amount that you would give to supply for that need. And of course, Reagan loves verse 7, and why wouldn't he? Verse 8 and verse 9, especially verse 9, where Jesus was, you talk about rich and poor. I'm running out of screen space, guys, but like Jesus and me, and he was like, I'll empty myself of everything. I will go below you so that I can maybe lift you up, so that when I take on kingship again, you will be drawn to me. And sorry about the hands, first time I've ever used them. But I think that Christ has set that model. So I know this is tough. You start talking about actual dollars and cents, you blow people away. But this text is getting you to see you gave it all to God. We're in equal fellowship. Maybe there's some ramifications to that.
Yeah, there's a couple other ways that verse 13 gets rendered in different translations, particularly if you look at, say, the ESV, it says, but as a matter of fairness. And I want to bring that point up because how often have you or I, or those that we surround ourselves with, stated the world isn't fair? And it's true, it's not. And yet in Christ, Paul is using that concept of equality and fair to help drive us to the kind of spiritual behavior that makes us better. Again, he is now trying to really push and pull in whatever ways are on the table to get us to do more, to be more, to serve more. And they're all in this same realm of what you've been doing is okay, but have you perceived your potential? Like you can do a whole lot more for one another. And remember, this is a group at Corinth, and we kind of back up just a little bit, that is kind of broken in its demographics. They have numbers of that group who are obviously from a lower caste in the culture by the way that they're interacted with, but there are also some who certainly have means because they're actually rebuked for how they handled their means. You shame those who have not. And so in that context, we know that they have the ability to do more than some. And Paul is saying you can actually do more than you think by using this callback to a Macedonian church that exceeded expectations. So there's, again, that same competition of grace that began with that drop of the gauntlet. Reagan?
Well, I think a lot of it is how do we view the opportunities that we have to help others? You know, like the riches, there's riches in being liberal, right? There's riches, there's reward in giving. Paul said that Jesus said it is more blessed to give than to receive, right? And so the way he words it in verse 14, that now at this time your abundance, so you've got a lot of money, right? God provides seed to the sower. You've got a lot of seed, to use the terminology of chapter 9, may supply their lack. They don't. It's famine. They don't have much, right? But then he turns it around and he says that their abundance also may supply your lack. So they have an abundance of need. And so now your lack is, I need people to give to, right? Like I've got so much, like who am I going to give it to? And he says, like, you're getting something out of this. Like you get the opportunity to show grace to them. You get the opportunity to give out of the riches of your liberality. And so each of you are doing something for the other. It's not just, hey, you know, those poor pitiful souls in Jerusalem, like on our high horse, we're able to give something to them. No, they're giving something back to us in this very opportunity to show our liberality, to show our grace in these things. And all of that is motivated by verse 9, as Chris said a moment ago. I mean, I can't get my hands, I can lean back a little further, right? Like the understatement of the century is, Jesus was rich. I mean, you think like he was God of heaven and earth and he became poor. I mean, what an understatement that is. He didn't just come to earth and live as a man in some palace somewhere as some physical king. Like he was born in a manger, raised by a carpenter, and then died on a cross. I mean, how's that? That's the best I can do.
Diagonal. He's gone diagonal on us.
Gone diagonal on us. Like, though he were rich, he became poor. Why? That you through his poverty might become rich. Now, if Jesus was willing to do that, like, can't you like send a few dollars to your needy brethren that they, through the things that you're doing, might have their needs supplied, their lack supplied? I mean, it's just, if we grasp that and we have the thankful heart that he describes in the next verse, in verse 16, if we're thanking God for what he's done for us, I'm going to use my house. Like I have a beautiful, nice house. I'm going to use that to show hospitality towards somebody else. And they're supplying my lack in doing that. I've got this big, beautiful house that God expects me to use. Like, how am I going to use it? Well, I'm going to use it by showing hospitality. If I've got something in my pocket, if I've got money in my pocket, well, somebody is supplying my need. If they've got something that I can give for them, so that I can be generous in that way, and all of the things that that's going to do for me as I imitate Christ in that.
Philip, he's right. Everything he said is right about the pocket. I'm going to ratchet this up a little bit, throw a little controversy into it.
Hey.
This text, while Reagan's right about the pocket, and I made the same point, is not about Reagan's pocket. This is about what it is, but it's about Sunday giving. This is about going to services on Sunday, taking money out of your pocket, like Reagan said, although hospitality is certainly a good point, putting it in a treasury, 1 Corinthians 16, accumulating it into a fund. Why? So that we can do what? So that when brethren have need, we are ready to give, to liberally give. I think this is just as much a message to the eldership as it is to the members. The members are like, well, you want me to go dig in my couches? He's like, no, you've been doing that every Sunday. Every Sunday you've been giving. My message to members is give on Sunday with this heart. The message to elders is stop saving it in the bank. Stop using it for things that aren't the mission. One of the things that frustrates me, guys, I got to get out of the screen here to do this, is when there's this real need. Hurricane Harvey, 2017. Hurricane Harvey ravages Houston, Southeast Texas. And when an eldership is like, guys, we've got Christians who've lost their jobs, much like we have now. We got Christians who are decimated. We need to help those Christians. Guys, let's have some special contributions. Well, let's accumulate our funds together on a Saturday and see how much. What? You've been giving every Sunday just for this. Eldership should have been like, let's dig to the bottom of what we can possibly do from the treasury we've already accumulated. Forget the 6 months, savings, rainy day fund. Forget the new projector we want for classroom number 7. Let's take what we've got and let's give it. And it's just always been, and Lindell, I think, is doing well. We're working on it. But throughout the history of my preaching, it's always been such a confusion to me why when brethren had genuine need, we're like, ooh, we should probably pull some money together for that. And I'll tell you another thing. This is why a lot of people don't give on Sundays in local churches like they could. My mother, she'll tell you, she'll say, growing up where we went to church, I gave about half on Sunday that I could have given. I was like, what? She said, because I knew the elders are going to put it in a bank for 2058. When an AC unit went out. I wanted to help Christians. So I gave whatever they needed to fulfill their budget. And then I went out and I helped Christians. She was super good at that. What if we did it right? What if on Sundays we just poured money into this treasury because we knew that the brethren in the Philippines, that the brethren in Southeast Texas, that the brethren having coronavirus problems, we're going to just start writing checks. So this is an individual chapter, but it's very much a collective thing too. And that's where I stand on that.
Well, that's awesome. I think you're exactly right. And I'm going to say, from a positive standpoint, lots of elderships are doing that, and they ought to be. I'm going to brag on our elders for just a little bit here at Timberland. They had money in the bank, right? And why is that money in the bank? That there be no collections when those things come up, right? That you don't have to say, well, let's have a special blah, blah, blah. Let's get it together.
Wait. Back up again. Say that citation of the text again, because it's a really important one.
It's so that you don't have to have collections.
Okay, just wanted to clarify.
When the need arises, right? So that there be no collections when I come, Paul says, right? I want the money already assembled so that I can take it because there's a need now. And so you don't have to have all these special things. There's nothing wrong with that if you need to have those as well. But we were in the midst of a renovation of the building. And you know what our elders said during Hurricane Harvey? That's the example Chris used. They said, we've got all this money in the bank that's supposed to go to this renovation. There are Christians in need right now who don't have a place to worship. And so they took that big pile of money and they said, put the renovations on hold. There are brethren in need. And they sent it the next day. They're calling elders saying, we've got money to send. And it wasn't oh, look at us, we're so great. It's we have an opportunity here because we've been blessed abundantly. And in the riches of our liberality, we're going to give from that. And so all that money in the bank, you know what that was for? It was for that time when it arose that the money was there to give. And to give right away to those who are in need.
And Philip,
Chris over here trying to be controversial.
In some cases, Philip, it wasn't money. Some churches didn't have money, but you know what they did? They organized massive units of workforces, and they sent Christians down there. We could talk about Harvey for the rest of the hour. It was a beautiful display of what God wants Christians to be in fellowship through his grace. It really was.
Yeah, and there wasn't some like
repair
you didn't
buildings after Katrina. You know, I went down and helped people with their homes, and that was in part able because churches opened up their coffers to fund the materials. So I can give labor, they can give materials for cash, and we rebuilt homes, rebuilt congregations, and it's biblical. That's like my emphasis with Reagan's comment there from the text. Like it's literally the reason the text is there. I'll say this: I want us to read verses 16 to 24. But we have like theoretically 4 more minutes, but do you guys have 15 more minutes? We can finish the chapter. Does your schedule give you the extra long? We're going to give a bonus episode because everything's bigger in Texas.
Sure. I had no idea when this ended, so I'm good with whatever.
Okay, so we're going to still try to come in under an hour at least. But when I make this quick comment, on a personal level, if anyone were to suggest to me that the parking lot is a higher priority than preaching or the care of our brethren, I will burn the conversation down at that point in time. Like, look, like it's never that way. Parking lot can handle itself. If we need it fixed, we'll fix it later. If there's a real legitimate biblical need, it's always higher. Gospel meetings, higher than the parking lot. Preaching the gospel overseas, higher than the parking lot. Caring for a brethren whose health is broken, higher than the parking lot, higher than the building, higher than all of those things. The more you have that attitude, I guarantee you the outcome tends to be both of them get done. You care for the brother and you fix the parking lot. It's a magical thing. It's almost like it's biblical. All right. Chris, Reagan, any more comments here before we jump into the last part of the text?
Reagan's got one. I'm going to kick it to him. But maybe what we should do as a church is reorganize the way we save. I think churches say, let's save extra money for a parking lot. And then if there happens to be a disaster, we'll help the people in the disaster instead, which is good. It's good. But why don't we say, hey, let's just start saving our money to help people. And if a pressing need doesn't come up, then we'll fix the parking lot. Sometimes it's the way you prioritize what you're doing with the funds from the top down. But we all have some areas we can grow in on that.
I call it proactive providence, right? Like we don't know what God is going to require in the future, what's going to happen. But if we are doing what we ought to do and saving for that opportunity when it arises, then God's going to help us to use that. And our lack is going to be supplied by him. And I think one of the beautiful things about Hurricane Harvey, this is what I was going to say, and then we'll move on. There wasn't like some bureaucracy or intermediary like organization where it takes 9 years to make all of that happen. An elder called an elder and said, what are your needs? And then money was sent to provide for those needs. I mean, that's the way the church is supposed to work. And it did. Like God's way works if we'll just follow it.
And I'll add this from an because a lot of folks who watch the regular Do the Work studies are evangelists. Let me tell you something. When I'm talking to seekers, people who want to know more about God and the work that the congregation is part of, when I emphasize that our congregation does its very best to be involved in literally helping people who need help, almost every time their eyes light up. Like, you're actually helping people? Yeah, let me introduce you to some of them, because they're your neighbors. That's a powerful evangelistic picture, because people want to be part of something that actually looks like Jesus. And that's just a little side point for those who are evangelistically minded. Let's go ahead though, and we're going to read now verses 16 through 24. I thought about bringing out the Message, but instead I'll stick with my standard translation, which is the ESV, but I am actually going to cite a little bit from the Message because there's parts of that translation later in our conversation that I think are really interesting. But here's the ESV, starting verse 16. And we're going to read all the way through chapter 8 now to the close, verse 24. But thanks be to God, who put in the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. With him we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself. and to show our goodwill. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. And with them, we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and of your boasting about you, and of our boasting about you to these men. You think about Titus and his interaction with Christians in the wake of someone like Paul. Paul creates waves around him. And Titus now is shown as being someone who shares that same kind of care for them to create wakes in their lives. And I love this obtuse reference to the brother who is famous for the gospel. That's a separate episode. We could dig into the who that is and all that things. But I love that kind of second tier. Hey, he's someone who's really cool is going to be with him, but he's not the one you need to pay attention to. It illustrates a principle that I talk about with weddings. I said, everybody, when the wedding starts, looks at the bride, but I always look at the groom, because the groom is going to tell me everything I need to know. His look tells me about everything that is going on at that moment. And he's equally terrified and equally amazed. And so looking at Titus, as opposed to looking at this famous brother, tells us everything we need to know about the core of this text. What else you guys got? I know I kind of went off on my soliloquy there for a second.
I didn't expect for us to talk about weddings in this text in 2 Corinthians 8. So that threw me a curveball for sure.
That's normal. It's normal. Get used to that.
Well, I think it's interesting, Paul he commends Titus, but really he gives like, this other guy's like better, if you want to put it in those terms, like he's more famous, he's more whatever, but there's no like competition in that way here. You talked about competition at the beginning of the text, like we're all just trying to do our work. We're all just trying to do what God has called us to do. And some are more well-known than others, and that's fine. That's good. May God bless them in what they're doing here. But in all things, they want their testimony and what they're known for in terms of God and in the sight of men, for both of those testimonies to be strong. And that was true of both these guys.
Yeah.
Whoever the second one was.
Did he not mention him on purpose? So did he not mention him because they already knew who it was? It's like he didn't even need to say his name, or did he want it to, or do you want to take that guy down a notch and be like, I'm going to mention Titus a couple times, but not you? Nobody knows. But I think it's still him they're talking about in verse 22, where it's like he's not just a pretty face. I mean, this guy, he's diligent, he's been tested, and he's great. I may be talking about him there. I would just focus here, Philip, not a lot from me on this, except you have this idea of the gracious work that continues. And then twice, verse 19 and verse 23, for the glory of the Lord himself, verse 19 and verse 23, a glory to Christ. It has to be to the glory of the Lord. You can organize things, you can have the different names, you can do whatever, but in the end, we're just a people who have received the grace of Jesus, have given our lives to Jesus, and we just want to glorify Jesus. Yesterday, I called a friend. I had a difficult situation I'm in, trying to make a decision on something, and I ran him through the ups and downs and ins and outs and options. And he said, Chris, no matter what you do, when it's all said and done, it has to be the thing that you think glorifies your Savior the most. And you can biblically argue for that, which I like that second part he added. He said, you don't just decide that it glorifies God, like you believe it glorifies Jesus most, and you believe you can biblically support it. And in this case, organizing efforts to help brethren in other places, really organizing it, that was the thing that glorified God the most. And maybe it should glorify God the most even still.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of practical things, and I know maybe Reagan's got a couple of great comments up his sleeve as well, but I want to put two things on the table. One of them is reflective. When I was a younger evangelist and I was trying to determine who might I suggest to the congregation as an evangelist for a gospel meeting, or maybe to work with another congregation. I struggled with a metric. I'm like, okay, well, here are the issues, and this is where they sit on all the issues. And at times, the list would change. Now these are the issues. And it created this kind of yo-yo experience for me as a Christian, and it was awful. And then, in part due to the leadership of the shepherds at Jerry Whitson Road, as a young evangelist still, I began to approach it a little bit differently. It's not that the issues didn't matter. They do, abundantly and specifically. But what matters is, can I trust them? Are they trustworthy? The Message translation refers to Titus with this clarity. He says, he's rock solid, trustworthy. And I'll say to you that that's one of the reasons that we should then reconsider our own interconnected work. That are we trustworthy? It doesn't mean we're perfect. It means we're actually someone you can rely upon. And we know that's a big deal for Paul. Like literally, it's a story in the scriptures that he has to trust these people. But that's the character trait that mattered the most, not only to Paul, but to this role. And I think it should matter the most when we're engaging in consideration of how do we manage our work in that area is, are we trustworthy? And do I trust them? That's actually an easier question to ask than where a person is on 15 different issues.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe that's a pretty good response if somebody comes at you with all these different issues. Look, do you trust me? Do you trust me or not on this? Now, I can talk about all these specifically, but why are you asking me to come if you don't trust me? I don't think there's a higher compliment that Paul could give a fellow worker. He does this with Tychicus, who carried a lot of his letters, here with Titus, but that idea of them being trustworthy. That's if Paul said, and you look at Paul, he could probably be a little bit of a micromanager. Like maybe he had that tendency, but like if he said, I'm going to send this guy and it's like, I'm coming to you, I'm not sure that there's a better compliment that he could give. I trust him to preach the gospel just like I would preach the gospel.
Yeah. And then here's another one, and this specifically ties into our conversation about interacting with congregations both in the U.S. and abroad. The very best thing that a church can do is follow that model. Don't send just the money, send a man. Send a man who is trustworthy. He doesn't necessarily have to be the best Bible teacher. What he needs is to be someone that you can trust. And as an example, if I was looking at the congregation there where Reagan is at, I would find someone with the last name Penn and just hand them the responsibility. I learned a lot from that particular family and the patriarchs of that clan. And look, I trust you. I still have catchphrases I use that I learned from him. And so I would just say, look, whatever he does, I guarantee you it's going to be good. I guarantee you it's going to be honest. And that's because of the experience of relationship. And I think we need to do that more. Too often we just send the cash, send the character with it. It is another component. And that creates a great turnaround because now there's a relationship that's been established between the brethren in East Texas behind the Pine Curtain and the brethren in the southern parts of Mindanao or in the Philippines or in South Texas or in Bolivia or wherever. And that relationship will create the opportunity for fellowship that might be necessary when the tables do get turned. And the church at Lindale or the church there in anywhere here in East Side, all of a sudden Timberland Drive needs spiritual assistance from somebody who has a different perspective. Well, now you've got a relationship to kind of pull on. I think there's some value to that too.
I have a question. We have 8 minutes left. I'm sure you can easily answer it in 8 less minutes. But would it be authorized for a church to send a few guys to travel around Texas and say, would you like to give money from your treasury that we can pool together to take directly to the church that's in need? Because in these texts, they weren't sending these guys to the church that needed it. They were sending it to the churches who were giving. They were saying, hey, I'm Paul, this is Titus, this is Reagan, the famous guy. And we're here so that you can give the money to us. And it doesn't go back to the Antioch church to filter through their leadership, but it does go in our pockets. And we're accumulating money from Philippi, and we're accumulating money from Thessalonica and all the regions of Achaia and Ephesus. and we're going to take all that directly to them. I mean, that model is almost anathema today in conservative churches, but is that not the model that we see on display here?
I will say it this way. It is textual, but uncomfortable. And we do not handle discomfort well in America. We have convenient automatic systems to accomplish that for us. But if you were to go anywhere overseas where there is not the high level of economic technicality and cash is king, then it becomes much more like what you read and see here in the Corinthian letter as the norm. Because that's the only way you can get funds from one place to another. Literally carrying the cash in your pocket.
But is the beautiful argument you just made before I started speaking. The beautiful argument you just made is we need faces. We need people to show up and say, hey, I'm here to talk to you guys. The church down in Houston, those churches are decimated. The church in Beaumont's got 50 people who lost their homes. I'm not from there. They're trying to put their house back together. I'm from up here in Lindale, but we're trying to accumulate funds to send direct. It doesn't go through a sponsoring church. It doesn't go back to the Lindale Treasury, but we're trying to get money in like FaceTime, and then maybe they can digitally give. I think you're onto something that we're uncomfortable with, and maybe we need to reevaluate.
I say I've done variations of that in a second. I'll talk about it, but let Reagan come in real quick.
Well, I'd just say I'd add one thing to that. What we normally saw too in the text is like there was somebody from that place who was going as well. You know, it wasn't just like, hey, Chris, I've never met you before. Here, take this money. Like they were sending someone that they knew and trusted to go with that money as well.
Yeah, they're building a herd or a gang, if you wanted to use modern terminology. And it's not a bad thing. That's the point. This is not a negative. This is ways to improve what is already there. And we really haven't been dealing with what's the authorized model of congregational interdependence, independence, autonomy, etc. That's not really even the focus of the text per se. It's all about these other principles. But on a practical level, this is something actually should happen more often. It does happen very often, both pre and post opportunities to preach overseas. I would go and present the plan to the eldership or present the plan to the congregation or give a report afterwards. And brethren would come to me and say, hey, I want to help. How can I help? It wasn't the direct thrust of my report, but I would say, okay, this is what you can do. I can take it with me on my next trip. You can send it to them directly, or here's another person going whom I trust. Or you can send someone yourself to go there. It did happen. It does happen, and it will happen. And so it's happening, but I don't think the model is maybe the most efficient one, and maybe not always the most textually accurate one, because the most textual accurate one probably is still uncomfortable for everybody. Cool. So that's the answer to the question. I don't think anyone's going to like any of it, but
well, I think
I really don't care.
It's thought provoking. We're Americanized, and we have to regard that and understand that. The last thing I would say, I know you're wrapping up, is from a marking perspective, obviously you're going to do 2 Corinthians 9. Is it next week you'll be doing that? Mm-hmm. You're going to get to verse 13, and they're going to say the liberality is to them and to all. And 2 Corinthians 9:13 is the single epicenter verse for general benevolence. I know this from several experiences. This is where it's like, boom, the gates open. You can send the funds to anybody that you want. I just encourage people to do some markings throughout this text, Philip. I encourage them to mark, if you're in 2 Corinthians 8 and you're looking at it right now, verse 4, support of the saints. Chapter 9, verse 1, ministry of the saints. Chapter 9, verse 12, the needs of the saints. 1 Corinthians 16, the saints. Romans 15, the saints. Like, let's just be really clear. Now, somebody may argue you can also do this for general benevolence, and that's worth having a discussion, I guess. But that's not what this was. This was purely for God's people in these locations, even though the famine no doubt had affected the entire community. Just know that 9:13 is a big tool for others, but if you follow this very carefully, the only conclusion you can reach is that this system helps Christians in that church now who need it, and to Christians anywhere who might need it in the future.
You're right. We're about to wrap things up. So what we typically do is go around the horn, just like you're watching some old, in the way back history of man, there used to be these things called, sports commentators, and sometimes they would go around the horn. And so we're going to do that. And here's a couple of key things. If you guys got something you need to plug that is great for brethren, great for believers, please do so. Chris, you're the regular, so you get to go first. Reagan gets a second to figure out what he might say. So what you got, Chris?
Well, I appreciate getting to come on this program. I love what you guys are doing. You've stuck with it, and I know you're helping people. So thanks. I'm glad to be a part of this. I love that in the middle of all the stuff we talked about, especially all the stuff we talked about in the second half, is really just this idea of receiving the grace of God in your life and giving yourself back to Him and just looking for opportunities to make that real. And so I'm glad we got to talk about that today. I talk about the program sometimes, Excel Still More. We're still doing that once a week. If you're looking for ways to be more like the Thessalonian brethren, some of our episodes talk about that. Sometimes we talk about working on you, and sometimes we talk about how working on you can start to affect people around you. And that's a real big passion in my life. So I'm thankful that we got to talk about that today, tangibly affecting people who need you around you. And I hope that the program, the Excel Still More program, is continuing to just encourage people to work on you some, and then turn that attention to glorifying Christ in your relationships.
Reagan, you're up.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad that I could be the Titus to the mystery man, Chris, and
Clearly the correct statement.
be along with him, riding his coattails. I'm just grateful to get to talk about 2 Corinthians. It's awesome. Our website is timberlandchurch.org. There might be some things that would be helpful to you there. Lots of resources for Bible study. And so a plug, here's the plug I want to give. You talked about Melvin Curry before we started this. His commentary on 2 Corinthians is incredible. And so if you want to dig deeper on some things, that would be a good resource for you, Melvin Curry. So I'm going to end what I have to say with a quote by him about this section. This gift of divine grace is the controlling theme of the collection narrative. That's chapters 8 and 9. Grace is personified in Christ, chapter 8, verse 9, and manifests itself both in the spirit of generosity and thanksgiving that characterizes the people of God.
Yeah. You cannot go wrong with making Melvin Curry your spirit animal. I'll just leave it at that. Been influenced by him positively now for more than 20 years, and I'm thankful for every ounce of encouragement that comes through that relationship. Chris has argued well for a return to the broadcast next week, so I think maybe Chris and Reagan will be on the episode with us next week. I kid, we'll talk about it. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. Depends on you guys' schedule, but you are welcome to come back next week if you'd like to finish out the discussion. We'll talk about that afterwards. Thank you to both of you guys. Thank you to all those who have been participating online. We got another number of great comments, so we weren't really able to get to them as much as we'd like. I do want to identify one thing. Terry tried to throw in some commentary about my lack of knowledge of this game where you take a small ball and you throw it around and there's like bases and stuff. That's not my sport, so I got nothing for you. It's not something that's my particular game. So whatever he says, probably accurate, don't really care. It's Terry, you can pay attention to it or not. Thank you to everyone else. A couple of things we always close this one. If you've got questions about this text, other Bible-related subjects, or you want to grow as a believer, we're happy to help. I know that's the case for Reagan. I know that's the case for Chris. I know that's the case for me and for even Terry. We want you to understand that God's design for you is that you've been built to live beyond this world for another world. We're designed to succeed at that journey, and He wants to bless us in the middle of our journey. If we can help you in any way meet that goal, reach out. Happy to help and strengthen your understanding of God, and I guarantee you'll probably